Assalamu alaikum. What I'd like to do today is to discuss the state of Israel. Israel has been in existence now since 1948. We just witnessed this past weekend the destruction, the havoc that Israel was responsible for in Gaza, the dozens of people who have been killed, women, children, and men, because they were trying to resist occupation and resist what Israel has become to them, a menace, a nightmare. So, what I'll try to do today is to discuss the genesis of the conflict. What is the problem? And then whether the Zionist state is the solution, what the Israeli strategic imperatives that sustain the Zionist project are, and then what are the most likely end of the conflict. These are the points that I'll try to cover today. Now, when we talk about Israel, for centuries, the world witnessed two Jewish communities: the Jews of Islam, as Bernard Lewis and Ismail Farouqi called them, and the Jews of Christendom, those who lived in the Christian West, as well as Russia. Ever since the Constitution of Medina in the first year of the Islamic calendar, Jewish communities and tribes in Arabia were recognized as intrinsic part of the Ummah or the community. For centuries thereafter, Jews lived in peace and security with Muslims and other faith communities throughout the Arab and Muslim world, creating what Jewish Encyclopedia calls the Jewish Golden Age, where Jewish philosophy, culture, and scholarship thrived. According to Lewis, the Jewish people were allowed to practice their religion and live according to the laws and scriptures of their community, that is, the Jews of Islam. He described the regulations under which the Jewish communities were subjected, where he says they were social and symbolic rather than tangible and practical in character. That is to say, these regulations serve to define the relationship between the two communities, Muslims and Jews, and not to oppress the Jewish population. On the other hand, Jewish communities in Europe lived for centuries in ghettos where they were discriminated against, ostracized, marginalized, and barely tolerated. The list of the social, legal, and religious incapacities and vulnerabilities is long, where every new Christian ruler would add to it. Professor Ismail Farouqi listed some of the prohibitions and restrictions imposed on the Jewish communities in Europe. Unless the Jewish communities lived in their own ghettos, they may not employ Christians, they may not disinherit their children who convert to Christianity, they must convert if they marry a Christian, they shall be ruled by Roman law rather than the law of the Torah, they shall not criticize Christian doctrines nor give evidence against other Christians, they shall not celebrate Jewish feasts, practice circumcision, or refrain from eating pork. They shall submit to baptism, refrain from practicing their customs, punished if they work on Sundays. They shall not appear in public during certain Christian holidays. They shall not work in agriculture. They shall not hold public offices, nor practice medicine on Christians, etc., etc., etc. In short, European Jews lived in such miserable conditions that they were practically forced to live in their own closed communities in order to escape these harsh realities. Furthermore, it is incontestable that the modern history of the European or Western Jews is intertwined with European modern history. So, as the rational age of European enlightenment dawned in the 17th and 18th century, when intellectual life was animated and where science and culture blossomed, while church dogma gave way to reason, it was then that the European Jew, who existed for centuries on sufferance, was finally emancipated. As they came out of their ghettos, they had to learn the vernacular language of the land and adopt it as their own, so they become acculturated. Within decades, many Jewish generations were assimilated. Even many religious leaders or rabbis adopted new interpretations of the scriptures and established different Jewish religious traditions, such as Reform Judaism in the United States, since religious freedom was guaranteed by the US Constitution. But despite liberté, égalité, fraternité, the assimilated and secular Jew still had to endure hatred, suspicion, and discrimination, as Theodor Herzl, the father of the Zionist movement, of modern Zionist movement, had witnessed firsthand as a journalist when he covered the Alfred Dreyfus trial in Paris in 1894. But despite the Enlightenment ideas that proliferated throughout Europe, with the exception of Russia, where they did not take root, the 19th century was the age of rampant nationalism and romanticism in Europe. So the lesson learned by this agnostic Jew turned rampant Zionist was that Jews would never be accepted or live safely anywhere. It was this manifestly anti-Jewish attitudes by racist Europe that convinced the early Zionists that Europe would never tolerate its Jews. This experience had set them on their quest to adopt an ideology, which is political Zionism, by asserting Jewish nationalism with all the diseases and fault lines of ethnocentrism, inventing practically a new religion to emancipate the Jews from what they perceived as the incurable disease of anti-Semitism. It was a completely European experience, fueled by discriminatory and dangerous practices such as the Russian pogroms. These experiences had no equivalence for the Jews who lived within the Muslim world. In fact, when the Jews were expelled from Spain in the 15th century, they settled across the Muslim world, including in North Africa and Palestine, even in Istanbul, the seat of the Caliphate. The tragedy of Palestine is therefore a direct consequence of intolerable Europe, including Russia, directing their racism and xenophobia against their own Jews. But what would make this far-fetched Zionist fantasy a reality was a calculating colonialist scheme hatched in London to ensure not only the permanent incapacitation of the Ottoman Empire, but also the permanent fragmentation of the Arab world in particular and the Muslim world in general. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 was born out of this unholy alliance between the Zionist movement and its colonial benefactors, without any regards to the indigenous people of the land or the impact on the people of the region. For over a century, the Zionist movement adopted an aggressive and belligerent program for the purpose of establishing an exclusive Jewish state in Palestine. This dangerous movement and the state it created were guided by many strategic imperatives that must be totally understood and comprehended if we are ever able to confront the destruction it has brought, the suffering it has unleashed, and the threat it has exposed not only to the Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims, but also to the Jews around the world, and indeed to the entire world. I will argue in this presentation that in order to achieve peace not only in Palestine and the region, but also for the entire humanity, the political Zionism and the political Zionist movement and its project in Palestine must be confronted and defeated, and all its institutions must be dismantled and disbanded. Note that I am differentiating between Zionist institutions and the Jewish people. They are not the same. Our quest must also be to save the true essence of Jewish culture and Jewish life from the dangerous Zionist path towards destruction. Let me now turn to the discussion when we talk about the Zionist imperatives. What are these imperatives? As I said, this state has been sustained now for over 70 years on 12 basic strategic imperatives. The first of those imperatives is exclusivism. In this imperative, Zionism calls for the ingathering of all or most Jews around the world in the historic land of Palestine. Zionism demands a publicly recognized and legally secured homeland in Palestine for the Jewish people. This was Theodor Herzl had advocated, that what Zionism wanted was an exclusive state for Jews in Palestine, even though at the time Palestine was not an empty land. It was a land that was populated by Palestinians. If we turn to Netanyahu, he said Israel is the national state not of all its citizens, but only of the Jewish people. This was what Benjamin Netanyahu, the current prime minister of the Zionist state, had said this year in 2019. In 2019, he is calling for a racist state, a state that will only recognize citizens who are of Jewish descent. So the first imperative then is that the state is an exclusive state for Jews only. Keep in mind that in today's population, within the historic state of Palestine, that is the Palestine of the 1948, the West Bank, the Gaza, Jerusalem, the whole historic land of Palestine, today we have more Palestinians in this geography, in this land, than we have even Jews. So what he is calling for, what the Zionist leaders are calling for, are basically an apartheid state, where only one part of the people will be recognized with full rights, while the other, which is even more populous, are totally denied any political or economic or even human rights. The second imperative that the Zionist project has, which I call strategic imperative 2, is exclusion. In this imperative, Zionism calls for the expulsion, exile, or banishment of all or as many Palestinians from the historic land of Palestine as possible. This started before 1948, but was consolidated in 1948, where over 530 villages were totally erased from the map, and where over 80% of the Palestinians were expelled from their homeland. Somewhere in the neighborhood of over 800,000 people were expelled. Today, these 800,000 number over 7 million, perhaps as many as 7.5 million as descendants of refugees. David Ben-Gurion, who is the first prime minister of the state of Israel, and who actually was the founder of the state when he was the head of the Jewish Agency before 1948, he said in 1937 in a letter, "We must," and I repeat, "we must expel Arabs and take their place." This was one of the letters that was found among his possessions after he died. Ze'ev Jupinsky, the other Zionist leader, was credited with being the head of the revisionist Zionist movement. He says no argument was possible with the Palestinian Arab. They would accept Zionism only when they found themselves up against an iron wall, when they realized they had no alternative but to accept Jewish settlement, that is, at the barrel of the gun. The third strategic imperative for Zionism is expansion and colonization, what I would call Israel's manifest destiny, where in this imperative Zionism calls for the gradual expansion of the Zionist state by seizing as much land as they possibly can. In this imperative, you could see, for example, a map that has been popular now among many people who are advocates of Palestine and Palestinian rights. You could see that while the Jewish lands did not constitute, even after over 28 years of British mandate, more than 6% of Palestinian land, over time it has expanded until today. Palestinians are simply Bantustans, live in Bantustans, inside their state. The fourth strategic imperative and principle for the State of Israel is creating facts on the ground, fait accompli. This is obviously a geopolitical term that imposes a situation in reality as opposed to an abstract. But in this imperative, the Zionist movement has used this strategy for over a century in order to obtain gradual and full control over all of Palestine as well as other territories such as the Golan Heights in Syria and Shaba Farms in Lebanon and others. But you could see here that the Zionist movement was not able to gobble up state of Palestine or the country of Palestine all at once, so it did it in gradual stages until it was able to get all of Palestine in 1967 after the Six-Day War, in which Israel was the instigator of that war, I might add. And then you could see also that since then, hundreds of colonies have come across where they have been populated within Palestinian territories, within Palestinian land, where today we find over 800,000 Israeli Jews living in these colonists that have been taken from land owned by Palestinians, mostly in the West Bank. The fifth strategic imperative for the State of Israel to sustain itself is creating a garrison state. Ever since its establishment, Israel created a military-based society where it's a strategic imperative that security and survival are paramount, and where most crucial decisions are based on military measures and they take precedence over all else. Their military budget is the highest in the world per capita. In Israeli society, the military is supreme. That's why you find that many Israeli prime ministers, they come from a military background. Out of 6.5 million Jews today, over half have served or are considered fit to serve in the military. Today they have about 650,000, but even that, you could see that this state also has problem because today many Jews don't want to serve in the military. Unlike the generation of their fathers and forefathers, many of them tried to escape serving in the military. It's the beginning of the disintegration of the state, I might add. The sixth strategic imperative is developing the military doctrine that says that overwhelming force, that Israel must have an overwhelming force for it to win against any and all enemies by maintaining military technological edge over all its rivals. In other words, in the Israeli military doctrine, they must win all wars against all enemies, whether individuals or combined, that they must fight on enemy territories and using overwhelming forces to deter enemy and employ all means available to them, regardless, even if some of these weapons have been prohibited internationally, as we have seen in many wars and in many battles in the past. So they have developed this military doctrine, and you could see that this military doctrine, while it served the state well in its early years, and the last more than 20 years, they have been having difficulty in trying to employ this, as we have seen in different wars, whether in southern Lebanon or in Gaza. The seventh strategic imperative is maintain monopoly over nuclear weapons. Israel today, it is incontestable, it is not even arguable that Israel today possesses between 200 and 400 nuclear weapons. Israel is not signatory to the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. It has bombed Iraq in 81, Pakistan. They were contemplating actually bombing Pakistan in 84. They bombed Syria in 2007. Look at their obsession about what they say about Iran's nuclear program, that they would like to maintain this monopoly because they think this is how they can maintain themselves as a regional hegemon, which is a fantasy because they can't get away with using nuclear weapons against their neighbors, not to say that they will be affected directly if they even think about using them. At any rate, this is one of their imperatives, which I think is folly because it cannot be operated on. And especially against Palestinians. I mean, can they actually use nuclear weapons against Palestinians? Of course not. And I think at the end, the state will implode from within. The eighth strategic imperative that Israel has been employing and with much efficiency is to build the most efficient, sophisticated, and ruthless security apparatus and intelligence operations needed to control the populations in the territories and to eliminate threats and manipulate regional politics. You could see this in the different intelligence apparatuses and intelligence institutions and organizations that Israel has built, whether from the Mossad to Aman to Shin Bet to Shabak, all these different and the different also special forces and so on and so forth, all these different organizations Israel has built in order to be able to control Palestinians and try to manipulate politics in the region. But even with that, they are finding it even much more difficult to be able to neutralize what they consider as a threat, because the Palestinians, despite all the different brutal ways they have been dealing with them, and despite the crackdowns that have come and have never really stopped from the Israeli side ever since the emergence of the state in 1948, despite all that, Palestinians are still resisting, and even that resistance is growing every year. But this is one of the strategic imperatives, is to build such ruthless. A new book actually came out this year or last year. It's called Kill and Rise First. Rise and Kill First. Rise and Kill First by Ronan Bergman, who is a military correspondent for one of the dailies, but also obviously he has access to one of the leaders within the Mossad. What the book is about, it's the secret is the secret history of Israelis targeted assassinations. It talks about hundreds, literally thousands of operations where Israel employed in order to kill Palestinians. That kind of work, that kind of things that Israel has been trying to employ by neutralizing and killing Palestinians and others who resist its colonialist policies and expansion is not sustainable. Because it's interesting, it's 631 pages, 629 pages are actually depressing, but the last 2 pages, they actually that head of the Mossad, I think it was Meir Dogan, that he acknowledges and he admits that they may have won battles, but they lost the war because the Palestinians still resist, and the Palestinians are still staying on their own land, and they're actually more in number today, numerous than Israeli Jews. The ninth strategic imperative is for Israel to sustain itself is to link it tightly with an international power, international benefactor, even if they have to serve as a client state. We saw this when they were created and sustained and nurtured by Britain during the mandate and before the creation of the state, and later on by Russia and Czechoslovakia briefly, then Germany, and then France in the 50s and 60s, and since 1973 by the United States. So Israel is always dependent on a foreign government and foreign country, and that also could not be sustained because Israel is not accepted in its own neighborhood. It's always going to look over its shoulder because it is rejected, because it was established on falsehood and because it has sustained itself on violence, on terrorism, on destruction. And this was from the very beginning. They offered themselves to be a client state. Here is a statement by Theodor Herzl that he wrote to colonialist Britain, and he was trying to convince them to use Zionists basically as their own clients in the area. And I quote, "I believe it would be a good thing for our cause if the English were forced to leave Egypt. They would then be obliged to seek out another road to India in place of the Suez Canal, which would be lost to them or at least rendered insecure. In that event, a modern, and I emphasize here, a modern Jewish Palestine with a railroad from Jaffa to the Persian Gulf would resolve their difficulty." In other words, he was offering Zionists to become the client state for the British in case they have to leave Egypt. Chaim Weizmann, who was also the first president of the Zionist state, and he wrote in his autobiography, and I quote, "We had long pointed out to the British, and I repeated it again in my interview with Lord Cecil, that a Jewish Palestine would be a safeguard to England," and I emphasize, in particular in respect to the Suez Canal. Our foresight had larger bearings than we ourselves understood. It is proper to ask, after this interval of a quarter of a century, with the Second World War fresh in our memories, what the position would have been in the Near East, not for England alone, but for the world democratic cause, if we had not provided in Palestine a foothold for England. Again, this is offering themselves to be a client state for colonialist powers. The 10th strategic imperative for the Zionists is to keep world Jewry, especially in the US and Europe, Zionist with unquestionable support for Israel. And you can see the institutions that they try to control throughout so that they can entice and bring world Jewry to Israel and to have their support through lobbying, media, and all these kind of things, and funding, and billions of dollars go every year to support the Zionist state. And even though they claim to be a state that is sustaining itself economically, yet they get billions of dollars every year, and not only from U.S. Congress and U.S. administration, but also from Jews around the world to sustain that state. So they want to keep this because this is their lifeline in order to keep the protection, the diplomatic, political, military, economic, and so on, coming from the U.S. The 11th strategic imperative is to keep their enemies divided and weak, that is, to fragment the Middle East and beyond. We can see how they try to divide and manipulate the Palestinians into Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, diaspora, and so on and so forth. We've also seen what is called the Al-Arian plan, where they try to fragment the Middle East further, not just the 22 states, the Sykes-Picot system has resulted in, but also they try to fragment them even further. You can see Israeli hands and fingers all over the place in trying to have these different separatist groups. They try to support, the Kurdish state, a southern Sudan state, the different fragmentation in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and others. This is in essence what the audit plan was, that was also adopted by Sharon, and he gave a speech about it. At any rate, the plan says in order to maintain hegemony throughout the Middle East and ensure survival, Israel must be the strongest state in the region. So because of demographics and other reasons, they need to, and for them to become the regional hegemon, all other states must be broken up and fragmented on the basis of ethnic and sectarian lines, which is a disaster if that happens. This would be a continuous wars, endless wars that will be totally devastating to the region. So, the last imperative that I would like to emphasize that sustains the state, which is strategic imperative 12, for Israel to become regional hegemon by allying themselves with minorities. This is the continuation of strategic imperative 11, and separatists and despots and tyrants, and fighting popular, independent, and democratic movements. And that's how we can understand what happens throughout the history. They were against Nasser when he was trying to unite the Arabs in the 50s and 60s. They tried to align themselves with the Shah in the 1970s, the Maronites in the 1980s. They are against the Arab Spring movements. We've seen that, and how they try to align themselves now with the despots and military dictators throughout the Middle East, as well as Arab monarchs who have basically allied themselves with people outside the region so that they can keep their rule. And that's what Israel is trying to do. So, in short, if any of these imperatives, if Israel loses one or more, or a combination of which, that state will not survive. And now you could see that there is a new movement across the region where the people try to assert their power. It's still in the early stages. We've seen the setbacks that happened after 2011, but these setbacks will not be there forever. After a while, people will they have setbacks. They will stand up again, and they will take their matters into their own hands, and they will be able to bring back their willpower and resist and stand up and revolt against tyrants and against dictators. We've seen that in Tunisia. We saw it in other places throughout the Middle East. And I do not believe that the dictators and the tyrants would be able to stay the course and to be able to stay as rulers forever. These things will take their time. Revolutions take the time, but eventually what we have here is a new region in which Israel cannot survive. Add to that the many problems that exist within Israel. So, what I'm trying to say here is that, how do I see the end of the conflict scenarios? First of all, these strategic imperatives that Israel has been relying on for its survival for over 70 years, some of them have already become inoperable, and the inoperability of these will even expand further. And the more they lose these strategic imperatives, the more the end of the state would come